The American plains, beautiful, untouched for centuries except for the native people who inhabited them. Then, an invasion. Western expansion. For white settlers, it meant prosperity and fresh opportunities. For native tribes like the Cheyenne, however, the influx of foreigners meant an end to the lifestyle they had always known. Western territories quickly became the breeding ground for trade routes such as the Santa Fe Trail. The building of these trade forts and increased numbers of travelers heading west made it difficult for the Native Americans to continue hunting in the region. One man, William Bent, came to what is now southern Colorado to build Bent's Fort. This fort became a place where white settlers could take refuge and trade for goods they needed for the rest of their journey. But without the help of the Cheyenne people, Bent knew that any attempt to grow would fail. When he began relations with the tribe, he met White Thunder, a very influential chief, and his daughter Owl Woman. William Bent knew that a marriage to Owl Woman would unite the Cheyenne and the settlers at Bent's Fort in prosperous trade. So when White Thunder offered him a marriage with Owl Woman, William Bent gladly accepted. This marriage proved to be a catalyst for major change in the region, and she helped the white settlers get along with and successfully trade with the Cheyenne people. She did this by taking part in all business deals and negotiations alongside William, and influencing him to change company policy at his fort to allow natives to use the fort alongside whites. Her actions disrupted racial boundaries and women's rights in that time period. Then, they had a son. His name was George Bent. George Bent passed through the societal crack created by the interracial marriage of his parents, William Bent and Owl Woman, in Colorado. He went on to break the barrier of misconception about native cultures held by the American settlers in his lifetime. His life work of writing detailed first-hand accounts of Cheyenne life in the West stands today as a resource for historians seeking to gain a greater understanding of the relationships between Americans and the U.S. government. When George Bent was born on July 7, 1843, in Bent's Old Fort as a child of a white man and Native American woman, he was a testament to the barrier-breaking love of his parents. Owl Woman unfortunately passed away in 1846 while giving birth to her last child, Julia. George Bent was only 3. Up until this point, he had a strong grip on both cultures of his parents, but with the death of his mother and him now being raised by William's new wife, Yellow Woman, who isolated him from the fort and the white people, he lost his grip on his father's culture, which he didn't regain until he was sent to school in the eastern part of the country. It was during this time in his life that George saw how easily cultures could be erased from history, and therefore decided to include the tragedies and triumphs of both cultures in his letters and other writings. Start quote. Those who went with Black Kettle were all or almost all killed by soldiers. Shiv caused lots of trouble. He was the cause of lots of innocent white people and Indians' death. Respectfully, George Bent. End quote.
George lived mainly with the Cheyenne people for 10 years, where he learned their language and became accustomed to their ways, which would serve him well in his future endeavors. In 1853, George and his siblings went to Missouri into the care of Colonel Boone. George Bent began attending school and eventually graduated from Webster College. This broke a barrier because Native Americans at the time did not go to school like white people, and most were educated by their own families or tribes. He became a highly regarded, educated man in the eyes of the white settlers, unlike the rest of the Cheyenne. Unfortunately, in 1861, the Civil War erupted. George's letters recalling his experiences give information about what was going on in his time here. Start quote. And then we saw the soldiers charging down the creek.
He's captured down at Corinth, and he's sent out here to his father's custody. Well, he's a former Confederate soldier, and he's half Cheyenne, hanging around Fort Lyon. So there's a lot of things that could go wrong there. And so he goes out and lives with his mother's family, who that's when they've been told to go to Sand Creek. But with him having that background as a former Confederate, and then you have Sand Creek and the aftermath, because he can read and write, that helps out the tribes quite a bit figuring out some information.
Before the Civil War, Bent's Fort and many other white settlements in the West and South were manned by regular U.S. military men to keep natives, quote, under control. There were many small conflicts over the course of the existence of the fort. Tragically, while he lived his native lifestyle, he witnessed atrocities committed against the Cheyenne and Arapaho by the Colorado Volunteers, worst of all being the 1864 Sand Creek Massacre. Prior to the conflict, many of the Cheyenne and Arapaho had begun peaceful regulations with the U.S. government. Cheyenne Chief Black Kettle had accepted a new settlement from the federal delegates. However, John Chivington and his men disregarded this, and in what historians consider an act of treachery, he attacked the peaceful Indians of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes who were camped in Sand Creek. 148 innocent lives were killed in the initial battle. Only 9 of Chivington's volunteers were killed. In his account of the battle, George wrote, start quote, 9 of Chivington's men came in. They had in their valises Whiteleaf and Little Wolf's scalps. End quote. George's account of the battle is one of the most detailed and commonly quoted about the massacre. Start quote. Most of us were wounded, men, women, and children. Bullets were coming from every direction during retreat from the village. End quote. After witnessing such a horrible battle, he had new aspirations. In the years to come, he met with George Hyde and remained in contact through letters. These letters began as a way to document Native American battles such as the Battle of Mud Springs, Rush Creek, and Platte Bridge. George Bent wanted to write to the world to preserve the history and culture of his people. George Hyde, writer and close friend of George Bent, happily agreed to help. Hyde is known as the Dean of American Indian Historians. They used the letters between them to put together a transcript and eventually published a book highlighting the life of the Southern Cheyenne. When George Bent passed away, George Hyde believed his life and his life work should be shared. Hyde used letters from Bent to write The Life of George Bent. This detailed book tells the story of George Bent. It has been referenced by historians many times since then. He worked tirelessly to educate about his experiences and the truth the world deserves to know about the past. Libraries across the Midwest have countless references to George Bent and his works. At the Denver Public Library, George Bent and George Hyde's letters are kept in their vault. There are hundreds of papers describing his split lifestyle between the settlers and his father's side, and the Cheyenne with his mother's side. George also drew over a dozen maps of the southern Colorado region, the Santa Fe Trail, the Sioux Territory, and much more. He had bank receipts from his financial endeavors and correspondence between him and the white settler government officials detailing the relations among them and how he made efforts to improve them. The expanse of the collection exhibits the intensity of his impact. Without his works, the Cheyenne in that region may have been largely forgotten. In the 1800s, many settlers and military men disregarded the validity of the Cheyenne and tried to erase the humility of this tribe from their accounts. This created a gap of knowledge and sources in his time period. One such gap is shown in the book Indian Horrors or Massacres by the Red Men. This book is a collection of battles and wars that were waged by the Native Americans that resulted in the death of white Americans. This book, however, omitted the battles that were waged by the white Americans, including the Sand Creek Massacre. George Bent included both the battles that were the fault of the Cheyenne and the battles that were purely defensive. He generally was unbiased in his accounts. This helped Bent to become one of the primary sources for historians searching the Southern Cheyenne and the relationship with the U.S. government. We discovered numerous books that discussed George Bent and his experiences, or were written with the help of Bent. Some of these books were The Cheyenne-Arapaho Ordeal, Owl Woman, Her Life with William Bent, By Cheyenne Campfires, and Great Documents in American Indian History, just to name a few. However, George's accounts were not only useful to historians, but many other fields of study referenced him as well. There is even an account of astronomists using George Bent's letters to find out when a solar eclipse occurred. People today are still feeling the impacts of George Bent's life. On findagrave.com, people still leave George Bent digital flowers and letters.
George Bent, a name that changed the course of American history forever. A person that broke the barrier of misconception about Native cultures held by the American settlers in his lifetime. A man that changed lives because he wasn't afraid of remembering the ugly parts of the past.